Welcome to Conversations in Color, a weekly series committed to open, honest conversation and exploring hard questions regarding race and racism in Western Wisconsin and beyond. Here is your host, Ed Hudgins.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Conversations in Color. My name is Adam Akala, and Ed Hudgins has the evening off. Conversations in Color is a series presented by Uniting Bridges, Converge Radio, and Pablo Center, dedicated to having hard conversations about topics regarding race and making them hyperlocal by having conversations with community thought leaders and various community members. We operate on three pillars here at Conversations in Color. First of all, we operate on humility, recognizing that none of us has all of the answers to the questions that we're going to be asking or the topics that we're going to be discussing. Honesty, we're going to lean in on the hard topics, and we're not going to shy away from things that might make us feel uncomfortable, because feeling uncomfortable is a sign of learning. And humanity. We value the dignity of every single person that we bring on this show and recognize that we all have different experiences that lead us to the thoughts that we have about the world that we live in. Tonight, we have three excellent panelists, as well as our resident panelist, Dr. Salika Ducksworth-Lawton, a professor of history at UW-Eau Claire, the president of Uniting Bridges, and our partner in crime on this show. Welcome, Dr. Salika.
Yay! Always happy to be here, and much as we love Ed, I'm happy to be working with Adam tonight.
All right. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists and have them tell you a little bit about themselves. We've got three excellent community members here tonight. We have, first off, Dale Peters. Dale, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, certainly, and thanks for inviting me to the show. I'm a native of Madison, Wisconsin, came up here to go to undergraduate school and ended up staying. And I worked for the city of Eau Claire for 31 years. In the last 5 years, I had the honor and privilege of being the city manager for the city of Eau Claire.
Excellent. And next up, we have Teresa O'Halloran. Teresa, welcome.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, Teresa O'Halloran here. I am a native of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and moved away for a while for college and law school, and then, to my great surprise, moved back in 1999 to Eau Claire and started working at the university in 2006, where I've enjoyed the past 15 plus years working as the director of the Affirmative Action Office and as the Title IX coordinator.
Excellent. And last but not least, we have Joe Abhold here. Hey, Joe.
Thanks, Adam. My name's Joe Abhold. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I grew up in rural Wisconsin over on the other side of the state. I tell people that my primary culture is agriculture. Became trained as a psychologist and worked in higher education for most of my career as a counseling center psychologist, a counseling center director, and then as the dean of students at UW-Eau Claire. And I'm now working in private practice where I work with veterans and do some EAP consulting. So glad to be here.
Excellent. Glad to have you all here this evening. So I'll be playing a dual role tonight as kind of the facilitator of our conversation, as well as our person dealing with community engagement. So if you have questions for our panel tonight, make sure that you drop them in the chat over on the right-hand side of Paragon. There you can message either myself by right-clicking my name, or you can just message publicly in that chat box, and we'll be able to intersperse those questions into our conversation tonight. Make sure that if you do have questions, you drop them in there, because that's why we do this series, is to hear what our community wants to know and have discussions around those topics. So it's a really important part of this series, and we hope that you get involved in this conversation. So to start us off, since we do like to discuss some hard stuff, it's a little bit heavy at times, we like to start off with an icebreaker. So the icebreaker tonight is, what commercial jingle gets stuck in your head all the time? I'll go first since I picked the question for this evening. I told the panel before this, I looked up a manual for my stackable washer dryer like 2 weeks ago, and now there's a commercial for an LG stackable washer dryer that's been playing nonstop on 2 of my streaming services, and it's got a jingle tuned to Baby I Got Your Money by Dirty Old Bastard. All right, I'll pass that over to Dale. Dale, you said you
Oh
had
dear. Well, I generally don't have jingles stuck in my head, but this time of year, it's a seasonal one that keeps coming back, and it's the Coke commercial. It says, I want to teach the world to sing and live in harmony. And so that's a jingle that is just very appropriate and seasonal, and it tends to get stuck in my head this time of year.
Teresa, what about you?
Just laughing at the bonus of a little sing-song from Dale. Thanks. So the jingles that pop into my head are oftentimes old. Like I think of, a product and then like, hey kids, did you know that there used to be this song that they'd sing for Ham's beer? And then I sing it and I can't believe that it was so bad. And so we look it up on the internet and it's fun. The Honeycomb Hideout, stuff like that.
Joe, what about you?
So at first I couldn't think of one, but then I remembered that there has been one just for the last day. We were watching a show last night, and it didn't take place in Wisconsin or anything like that, but they had a scene where they went to a grocery store and it was a Piggly Wiggly. And my immediate response was, they're shopping the pig, because the jingle is Piggly Wiggly, shop the pig. Yep. So that's the jingle. Yes, that's the jingle that I've had for the last 24 hours.
Oh, awesome. Salika, what about you?
In my house, my kids are Animaniac freaks, and Animaniacs is coming out with a reboot. So what they've been a live action reboot, and we're living in fear. So they call us Animaniacs is the one that would have been running through my head.
Awesome.
So.
All right. Well, what do you say we get this thing kicked off? Salika, why are we doing this show tonight on racism and its effect on white people, or whiteness and its effect on white people?
Because white people are hurt by white supremacy and racism as well. But can we back up and ask the question, what is whiteness? So we talk about white and we talk about whiteness. We have books like Tim Wise's White Like Me. So we act like white is a culture, but there have always been white people who have seen other pink-toned people as not white because of ethnicity or because of religion. I'm going to give John Kinville, one of my former students, book a shout out, The Gray Eagles of Chippewa Falls, and that's the hidden history of the Women's Ku Klux Klan in Wisconsin. And to understand that the Klan in northern Wisconsin went after people who were German, who were Italian, that we had a very large Klan here in Eau Claire, although the biggest one was over by Cadott, that they would burn crosses in Stanley, to talk about how whites can be racist against whites, but also how whites can be hurt by racism. There are things that racism raises the cost of for whites, whether we're talking about housing or anxiety, or if you're the parent of someone biracial or you're a transracial adoptee, or you're dating someone across race. But whiteness also hits sexuality too, because people who are not heterosexual have their whiteness removed. So we act like whiteness is this immutable rock that never changes, when in reality, who is white and what is white and who can be treated as such and what is the price of being seen as a race traitor are questions that we never really talk about. And we don't talk about the price that being unwelcoming can have for a community, that not being diverse has for a community. And I see Dale right about to jump in there. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, when you talk about that, that hadn't really hit me in a very hard or real way until I came across the deed of my grandparents had bought this tiny little property in Erie, Pennsylvania back in the 30s. And it went to my mother and then to my brother and I. And I had this deed, and it had in it all of these different people that the property couldn't be sold to. And I was just shocked by the list because it wasn't what we would consider today, people of color that are discriminated against. But it was a long list, from Poles to Czechs to Italians to Jews to Catholics. I mean, and, in the deed of this property, you could not sell this property to people we would consider to be Caucasian or white because of these other factors. And that was very real and very recent in our history and in our paperwork. So, yeah, it's a very interesting question and point that you make.
Well, even 5 years ago, was it Ben Shapiro? It was a conservative commentator who tried to join, it was either the Proud Boys or one of those groups, and was told he couldn't because he wasn't white. He was Jewish. And he said, but I agree. And he talked about this in the New York Times. I agree with everything you're saying. Why can't I join your group? And this includes the ethno-state and everything. And they told him, just frankly, because they didn't think he was white. So, it gets to this idea, and that restrictive covenant gets to this idea that what we have thought of as white in the past has not always been white, right? We've discriminated within whites on whites. And I think to talk about that's important, because I think that pain gets overlooked.
One of the things that having pondered that, was looking back and thinking about, well, how have we broken down some of those barriers and made improvements there? And what are the lessons that can be learned in progress that's been made there, so that we can apply that progress to areas that still need a lot more work in our society? I don't know that I have the answer, but we can see progress in some of those areas, and what can we learn from that would help us make further progress?
I think that some of that is to think about it as a social construct, to recognize that these things are socially constructed, and because they're socially constructed, they can be socially deconstructed, that, these things are not immutable. They're about societally created hierarchical structures of power and privilege. And if we recognize them as that, perhaps that will help some people to feel like, well, this is something that has been created by a society, by social structure. It's something that can be dismantled.
Yeah. I started thinking about the law when we're talking about the social constructs, Joe, and like the definition of whiteness in the law, especially when it actually legally was conferring different benefits to white people blatantly. It was shifty as to who got to be white. First it was Christians, and then it turned into this more racial definition, replete with fake science at the time. And then we come into the more modern times, and there's legal cases with Caucasian people going to the Supreme Court and being told actual Caucasian people, not, the modern terminology or the terminology that's being debunked now, I guess I should say, with regard to that word. Anyway, it was a little bit suspect how we were defining white. It was shifting with the societal ways.
Well, I come from a place, and that's the Guillory case in Louisiana that you're talking about, where she had grown up thinking she was white. And you have to understand there are white Guillories and there are black Guillories, but the black Guillories are very light-skinned. And somebody changed her birth certificate, which kept her out of a club. She sued and argued that race really was a property right. She sued, And the person who did this, some clerk had the time to sit down and find a picture of her great-great-grandfather, who it turned out was a black sharecropper. Now, the reason why I know this is because one of the Guillory cousins went to school with me. One of the light-skinned black Guillory cousins went to school with me. But Guillory versus the state of Louisiana is why the U.S. says or has a definition of 1/16 as white. But that comes from those old comes from those old black codes. It's ironic that when we had 25 lynchings in Wisconsin, only one was of somebody black. 5 were Native American. The rest were Germans and Italians. And it's because the people around them did not see Germans and Italians as white. Bringing it back into it. And because they did not see them as white, they thought that they were eligible for rough justice, as opposed to someone who was white, who was supposed to get the benefit of the criminal justice system.
So, Salika, just for a point of clarification, are we saying that white people that are othered in different ethnic categories, are they victims of racism or are they victims of discrimination? Because I think that there is an important distinction when discussing racism and discrimination, because outwardly, someone that is white presenting might not be discriminated against because of their whiteness, but the underlying things like queerness, like religion, like ethnicity, those are the types of things that get you othered as a white person. Is that what we're saying?
Well, you can get othered as a white person for that, or you can get othered because they know you're German, because they know you're Italian, because they know you're Creole. And if you present as white, are you white? We have people already making that argument, that if you present as white, and in academia, we've had a couple of people lose jobs because even though they were white presenting, they claimed to be biracial, and it turned out they weren't. So when it's race and when race is involved, if they think that being German is a racial designation, we would call it white racism. Even though, or the other term we would use is nativism. And nativism is when we treat ethnicity as a race, if that makes sense. And we treat ethnicity in this racialized way as if it's an immutable characteristic and it makes someone subhuman. So you can discriminate. I, as a black person, could discriminate against another black person, but I can also hate somebody because they're black. We don't talk about that, but there have been 2 Supreme Court cases on that. A black person can discriminate against a black person. Blacks and Asians, oh my Lord, that's Rodney King, the Rodney King riots. One of the reasons why I have proposed this is I wanted to push us to stop thinking about racism just in terms of black and white, and to start thinking about the way these things hurt us, if that makes sense.
So to move us forward, I guess, where does this sense of othering come from? Why do we do it? And I guess it's difficult to quantify this question. And usually saying racism or racist is something that shuts people down, and it makes them kind of fear that they are being called that or they are being attacked. So why do we have these feelings? And where does this white culture and othering that we do come from?
Oh, I think you said it, Adam. It's fear. It's fear of the unknown. It's fear of something that's different. It's a fear of a loss of opportunity. It's a fear of loss of prosperity. And I think that's one camp. The other camp that I think is insecurity, and people who are insecure and need to have power over others. And whether that's in a personal relationship or whether that's in a community, there are just some people who are bullies and need to have power, and they need to have that sense of power over others. So to me, I think it comes from either fear or insecurity. No, but let me turn to the psychologist for that.
One of the things I was thinking about is humans and evolution. To what extent are we clannish? Where othering goes a long way back, and to think about the fundamental nature of people. And I think the part that doesn't get talked about enough is that being empathic and working together to solve problems, I think, was as important of a trait in human beings, because we're very frail creatures, that we've made it this far, to work together and to support each other and to take care of each other. On the one side of the way of thinking about it, and on the other side is that being exclusionary and getting everything you can for yourself or for your group, is in-groupness and out-groupness. How internal is that to human beings? So
it's basically an allocation of resources and a fear of having a scarcity of resources. And how do you have your clan or your group make sure you have enough resources at the expense of others?
Teresa, you look like you're going to jump in.
I just feel like it speaks to the fact that if the society is built on racist principles, earlier in U.S. history, overtly racist principles were part of what we were built on. And it's kind of like the mainstream of everybody is just going to go with the flow. And if you're remarkable, you might be the abolitionist or something. If you're not remarkable, you're going to be the person who becomes prosperous and buys a couple slaves, because that's what people do to, if you're a rich, city dweller in the South at that time. I just meant that example popped into my head because I watched one of those. I think it's Henry something, the historian on PBS, had Larry David on and Bernie Sanders the other night. And it turns out Larry David has a prosperous Jewish forebear who had owned a couple of slaves in Mobile, Alabama. So, but, he may be remarkable in some ways. Apparently it's a very small Jewish community down there in Mobile 200 years ago. But, hey, I'm rich now. How do I get some household help? You go buy a slave. And he might think that's wrong somewhere in his head, but okay, that's what we do here. I just think there's a lot of unremarkable people who are going to go with the flow, and it's sad but true.
Well, when I teach about this, I talk about in Jamaica and in Mexico and other places, you had a lot of cross-racial intermarrying, huge amounts of cross-racial intermarrying that you don't see in the U.S. And that's really the big difference between Latin America, the Caribbean, and the U.S. We put this giant premium on racial purity. We have the one-drop rule. We still have people having the one-drop. We still have people losing their minds over interracial marriage. Whereas almost from the beginning, you look in Jamaica, you look in Haiti.
So why is that, Salika? What is it about that makes Jamaica or the Caribbean different than us when it comes to that?
Well, it seems like it was motives, because the people who were going there wanted to make money, and they would have children with the people they enslaved, and they would put wealth. They'd give their children wealth. They'd recognize their children. They weren't royal. They were merchants. So they didn't feel that bloodline or anything like that was truly important. And that's why Latin America, you see a lot of mestizo and you see a lot of criollo, and it's the shade of skin more than the race. Whereas, it got so bad in Jamaica, they actually passed laws to limit how much inheritance people could give to their mixed race children, because they were sometimes disinheriting their white children and giving it to their mixed race children. So you look at that, and then you look at the U.S., where very early on, we have this system where mixed race people are property, because the child followed the condition of the mother. Their property. And to the people who believed religiously in white supremacy, to the people who believed in these concepts, those mixed race children were an abomination. So they really felt that they had to fight that interracial mixing because they didn't want to lose their whiteness. They were afraid that too many mixed race people would mongrelize the white race. So those are two cultural ideas that really is why in this country we still have this set of people who lose their minds. But we also know, if you're a demographic historian, interracial, interethnic marriage and children are what assimilate people in. The reason why we see Germans as white, the reason why we see Italians as white, etc., is after World War II, you have this huge amount of interethnic marriage that came from World War II, mixing a lot of people together and them beginning to see that, no, these aren't the racial differences that they said. You know, they thought black people, there were white Southerners who thought black people had tails and they thought Italian people had tails because they thought they were different species. So you had to do that mixing.
So Lika, a lot of these things that we're discussing, kind of, they're past events. They're still current events because the U.S. is not an old country. But what's the motivation for keeping up these systems that were established 300 and some years ago and keeping them still today, or keeping them in modern forms that are somewhat disguised as kind of covert racism or systemic racism that isn't necessarily widely accepted, but why can't we all just throw our hands up and say, I don't care what color, what ethnicity, what sexual orientation you are? I mean, well, a lot to unpack with that question, but
I'm going to bounce back over to Dale and talk about fear. Because if you are a white person who fears multicultural people, I can sell you a house in an all-white area and charge you a premium for it. I can get you to take your kids to this private school that has no poor whites and no multicultural kids in it and charge you a premium for it. So if I can make you fearful, I can make money off of it. When I'm in class, I always say, when somebody starts talking about race too much, if you're white, you should put your hands on your wallet because they're about to steal some money from you. But, you know, there's these other things that I think, this idea of comfort and lacking anxiety. And I'm going to throw that out to the panelists about why, for some people, are these all white spaces more comfortable than the diverse spaces? What are they worrying about?
I think in part it is due to the fact of continued segregation, even though our laws have improved. You know, our state is, as an example, is still pretty segregated by race. And a colleague of mine who's retired now shared an article with me, 10 years ago now, about, you know, the network, you know, the old boys network, the old girls network is people that you know. So if you live in a segregated society and you're white, you're not going to know other people. So that who do you trust for recommending them for a job? They're going to be other white people if you're white because we're segregated. So I thought there was some truth to that. And it's probably sort of the Brown v. Board case justices.
Does this, you know, do you feel that this gets to the idea that, and this is an idea Fegan and Sykes talked about, that whites who have good intentions but don't have a lot of experience with people who are multicultural will feel anxious around people who are multicultural, and to avoid the anxiety, then they begin to avoid those people, and then they get accused of being racist because they're avoiding the people to not make a mistake or say the wrong thing.
I would say,
go on ahead.
On top of that, there's pretty clear cultural indoctrination to be afraid of people of color.
Right.
In the media, in families, all over the place. But I know personally, I've experienced that growing up. I was taught to be fearful of cities. And that was just, I wasn't necessarily told be afraid of cities, but it was the feeling that I got. And I know that I've carried that and had to work with that. So I think there's all kinds of messages in the media and throughout white culture that is telling people to be fearful, and then with that comes a lack of experience. With that comes very easily alienating people, not feeling empathically connected to people, feeling other than. And I think that's absolutely going to lead to discomfort and a lack of fluency, a lack of comfort. I think people can tell anytime you're talking to someone, or often when you're talking to someone, how comfortable that person is feeling, right? And that is, it's just quite obvious. So that builds, a distance rather than connection.
How do we, and this is still a very segregated country. If you look at the maps, you see that diverse people tend to cluster in smaller cities and areas, and then you move out. And it doesn't matter which state you are, you move into these hyper-white spaces. And we know that segregation causes anxiety. How can white people work on these issues of anxiety and the things that go along with them? I guess let me back up and say, what are the things that go along with the anxiety? What are the things that cause the anxiety? Because
I think imagine like you went out into the world and you found out, in Joe's example, you grew up in an area where you're taught to be afraid of people in the city, and you're taught to be afraid of Black people, and you're taught to be afraid of, whatever else. And you go to the city and you love it and you meet people there and they're wonderful and they're a diverse group. And then you come back home and you try to tell your parents about it and they resist, and they're still being racist about things and fearful, and that's stressful, and it's your parents and you love them and you want to continue to respect them, and nobody wants that to not happen, and then on down the line, your friends that you grew up with. I mean, goodness, I don't know if you all are friends with, like on Facebook, with your friends from long ago. I mean, there's some pretty bad things being said that you have to ignore, and that's it. I'm not, in Facebook is not a place to challenge things. So that opens up another topic, the social media. Maybe that could be a separate line of inquiry, but I think it's best to talk to your loved ones and tell them that they're wrong.
I think, Salika, to your question, it does come down to personal relationships and personal experiences. And, as Joe said, we have, we're indoctrinated with, at least, hopefully less and less, but those of us that have been around a little while, we were indoctrinated with, fear of people of color or people that were different, than us, and whatever that means. And so until you have the experiences that help you understand that not to be true, it's hard to cut through that. I was, at the time, I don't know that I felt this way, but I've come to learn that, and I guess I've never really talked about this publicly, but so when I was in elementary school in Madison, I was bused to a school that was predominantly Black, and so it was just one pocket neighborhood, and we got bused to this primarily Black school, and so I learned very early on that this color of the skin was not the issue. It was the other personality traits. And just because people are people, and there are things that you like, as an elementary school kid, or you don't like, and so you found your friends based upon the things that you had in common or an interest. You like comic books, or I don't know, whatever it happened to be. And that turned out to be a very valuable lesson early on, that it really came down to, people as people. And the other component that we don't talk much about is economics. My friendships turned out to be more along the lines of other families that were of the same economic status, regardless of the color of their skin. And so you learn that economics plays a huge role, and the economic status of a family or a person plays a very significant role in finding commonality. In the color of the skin was at least in that environment for me was not the primary determinant. And so I think having those opportunities to have positive experience and realize that people are people, and there are great people everywhere, and there are people that aren't so great everywhere, regardless of color of skin or ethnicity, and just being able to come to that realization however you can really helps go a long way.
Do you think that we impose race on some people, and this includes people who are white? I'm thinking in terms of kind of the if you know Northern Ireland, the whole Catholic Protestant thing, we impose race on people as a proxy for class or as an excuse to scapegoat them. And that's why we say he's white, but he's not white, or something like that. Why there are some whites who will remove whiteness from other whites, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think that point is apparent in most microaggressions that we see. When you talk to a person that is other than you and compliment them for something that you are surprised by. You are well-spoken for a Black person. You are a strong leader for a woman. When you use those microaggressions and things, I think that becomes even more apparent when we're talking about this kind of thing.
Well, how does that happen for people who are poor whites?
I mean, I think you can equate it to rural Wisconsin at the moment, where rural Wisconsin feels forgotten about by lawmakers in Madison, by the Democratic Party as a whole. I think that rural Wisconsinites are equated to kind of less educated, poor, in poverty. I think that really kind of dulls them down and makes them fear almost more than other people in their situation.
So the fear in some ways of being stereotyped is why they're stereotyping someone else. Kind of rolling it down here. If I'm thinking of the schoolyard, if you're the kid the bully is picking on, you kind of want to get the bully to go that way. And you'll sometimes, there's the kid who's going to fight back. Okay, that was me. I'm the one who tells my kids, take the detention, we'll get you ice cream. But there's the other kids who may be a little more socially smart, who are just going to try to redirect the bully towards another target. Right. If that makes sense.
Well, what's easier for you though, Salika? Is it standing up to the bully, or is it being like, look at them, they are worse, or they're different, or I can call out this thing? What's easier?
Well, that for me is a personality, because on my block, you were supposed to, it was old school. This is old school South. If somebody bullied you, you were supposed to beat them up. That was the expectation. You didn't, if you redirected them, you were going to ever live it down. It wasn't something you did. But that, I think, again, gets us into these cultural arguments, because we talk about, and bringing us back to this topic, it's how whites are sometimes deprived of friendships across race because of these fears.
Right. Absolutely.
And working in certain types of jobs and working in certain types of places or doing certain types of things because of these fears. And it's not that the Black community is imposing it. These fears are being imposed or reinforced by other whites. That you shouldn't do that because, and it might be something they want to do.
And I also think that white people just don't like being the minority in a group. We're so used to, especially in this area, being the predominant kind of social circle group. And so when we enter something that's not necessarily our comfort zone, we shut down, we feel out of place, we feel the same sense that most people of color feel in our society. And it's uncomfortable. We don't seek that out actively.
Well, there's a whole show we could do on the tipping point and group effect and comfort and all of that. But I want to bring it back to that idea of comfort, and especially those prices people pay. Dale and I are involved with a conference called Towards One Wisconsin. And one of the reasons we wanted to bring it here to Eau Claire was because our community has had a hard time keeping educated multicultural people here in the community.
Mm-hmm.
They have sometimes felt unwelcome. And one of the prices we pay is a labor shortage. And that we have problems getting sometimes whites who want to have diversity around them as well. So that doubles into that problem. Dale, do you want to pick that up?
Sure, you're absolutely correct. And that, I mean, employers want employees. They want talented employees. And I think the employment community and employers are becoming much more aware of how, the either systemic or active racism that might be happening within their organization. Hopefully not at the leadership level, but at any level within the organization, is costing them, because most employers have a hard time finding really good, talented employees. And so, realizing that if there are barriers to, one, having people come, say, to Eau Claire, or two, having them stay in Eau Claire and stay in the organization, both components are equally as important. I mean, it doesn't help if somebody comes to work for you, but then they don't feel welcome or included in such a way that then they leave. To your point, Salika. And so, I think that from an employment perspective and from an economic perspective, that's very real. And that there are articles on that are out there. Citigroup just came out with an article, a big study just in September, that said that racism is costing us about $16 trillion a year, in our economy. And there was a McKinsey report a little earlier than that said that if we could close that wealth gap, which means employment and wages and all of that, we'd have about a 6% higher GDP by 2028. So there's very real economic impact and loss to all of us by continuing to have these barriers to people of color being in the employment setting, in the housing setting, and the education setting, and the medical setting. I mean, when you add that all up, it's some very real numbers.
And I see some questions out in the chat. What do you think, Adam?
Yeah.
That goes right on to that.
Yes, let's reintroduce our panel real quick. So for those of you that are just joining us, or if you're tuning in tonight on Converge Radio, this is Conversations in Color, and tonight we are discussing how racism and whiteness affects white people, both allies and people that engage in white supremacist behavior or racist behavior. Our panelists this evening are our resident panelists, Dr. Salika Ducksworth-Lawton. We have Dale Peters here, Teresa O'Halloran, and Joe Abhold. So let's move over to some of these community questions that we got. First off, I've got a question here about social justice warriors. So social justice warriors are kind of this coined term for people that actively fight for anti-racist efforts and sometimes can speak out of turn in doing so. White allies that kind of take the voice of people of color and amplify it as their own, things like that. And so how do we feel like the social justice warrior movement fits into all this? How how can I, as a white ally, be a white ally without overstepping my boundaries and overshadowing a person of color's point of view? And what effects does that kind of mentality have on how I approach this?
Well, you have two things going on. You have some people who they have a white savior complex. They want to speak for multicultural people. They think we can't speak for ourselves. And it's kind of pity to poor people, you know. And I see that as different from the people who are out there this summer getting their heads basically bashed in. I mean, if you're white and you're willing to stand up to the police to protect Black people, I'm not calling you a social justice warrior, your brother. You just got the Black Pass. We will give you the Black Pass. Come on in, come to the picnic, get on the boat. Even if your potato salad has raisins, we will forgive you. If you're doing all of this, you know what I mean? If you're doing the right thing, we'll forgive you. But the people who tend to want to speak for us, this social justice warrior thing, they don't tend to be the people doing the hard work because they don't work with us. Does that make sense? They want to tell us what we need. But I think I think some of the whites around me are afraid of being called a social justice warrior. I think they're almost as afraid of being called that as being called a racist, which is kind of a catch-22. So SJW is a way of shutting down whites who try to do the right thing. I mean, Teresa and Joe, you would be seeing some of this in some of your, Joe, in your past work, and maybe some of your present work, and Teresa in your present work.
It's a title that's designed to minimize legitimate work also. You know, like if, you know, you're white and you care about Black people, it's like, well, you must just, what's your motivation is stupid or silly, or you're young, or you just want to hog the mic. It's a way of minimizing the person's voice, I think, to just, you know, it's like that old, you know, the snowflake thing. You're just young and foolish and we don't have to listen to you. You know, there used to be uglier ways to call people who worked for the movements, and I think it's a way to minimize.
Well, I see it as a newer version of race traitor.
Yep.
And if you call someone a race traitor, then you can treat them in the same way that you think the subhuman multicultural person deserves. You remove their whiteness in some ways.
Yeah, and those terms are sticky. I mean, the way that some people in our culture now think about BLM, you know, they don't say Black Lives Matter. BLM was there and they, you know, did this terrible thing. And it's a, you know, BLM is a bunch of people that think Black Lives Matter. All right. Can we say it that way? And now try and minimize it like you're doing. It doesn't work anymore.
Well, I think my students struggle with it. And this gets into the anxiety thing where they don't want to hijack a Black voice. They want to elevate a Black voice. Mm-hmm. But sometimes they don't know how because they haven't been around. Now, I'm not just Black people, but brown people. Mm-hmm. And we have students here who, if you're brown or biracial in this town and you're a student, you can be kind of fatigued as being forced to, or feel tokenized. So it's a hard thing to talk about. I think it's a hard thing to deal with. But I would say for a white to call somebody white a social justice warrior is really that race traitor. They're really going for that race traitor vibe. And that's something that maybe other whites should shut down. Which gets us into a couple of the other questions. I'm going to hand that back over to Adam.
Yeah. Kristalina here asked, what are your thoughts on false statistics, such as Black people are more violent? Look at these charts that prove Black neighborhoods have more violent crime. And how do those inaccuracies impact white communities?
You know, whenever I see that, I always say, can I have the crime charts for Prince Edward County in Virginia, which is one of the richest Black counties in the United States, or Berwick in Los Angeles? I start pulling it and think there's an economic argument here.
Well, it goes back to the economics versus the color of the skin. I mean, and really, right? I think we misplace it when we say that the crime is based upon or is a fact. That is tied directly to the color of the skin in the neighborhood. I think you miss the point completely if you don't look at the economics of the neighborhood, regardless of the color of the skin of the people in the neighborhood. I think that's what you were trying to say, Salika.
Yep, you said it more eloquently than me. I mean, in Louisiana, until crack came, and for us, crack came in 1981 when they shut down Miami, it moved over to the swamps. You could leave the front door open in our house in Slidell, and that was an all-Black segregated neighborhood. I'll admit, I was a forgetful child, and I think from the age of 11 to 13, I would forget my key. So the whole neighborhood knew there was a window open in the back of our house, that I was skinny. It was the bathroom. It was one of those little skinny bathroom windows that's probably smaller than the screen I'm talking to you on. And I could get through that window and get into the house and open the door. Nobody cared because there was that little crime. And that was an all-Black neighborhood. So we really have to look at economics and where policing concentrates in some ways, because there are statistics and statistics, and we can lie with statistics, and we can cherry pick statistics in many ways. Go ahead, Joe.
I think part of this issue goes to confirmation bias. It's not just necessarily that the statistics are creating the perceptions and beliefs. It's that the perception and beliefs are driving what we find when we go looking to explain things. So I think before the fact, people have their ideas. I mean, there's a very huge current example about how people are using their confirmation bias to disregard science for the last 9 months or so. And their beliefs about society and why things are happening the way they're happening and so on. But I think the issue of confirmation bias is a really big issue. That the false statistics, people are primed to believe those false statistics. And I think, part of what this goes to is back to the title of the conversation, how this hurts people, how this hurts white people. Is that it's a lack of critical thought. It's a lack of critical thinking, that you are believing what your parents believed and what their parents believed, and you're just kind of dragging this baggage forward with you without, critically examining it and exposing yourself to new experiences and new people and new ideas to challenge your own confirmation bias. So I think, to me, this ties back to the previous issue of sort of the social justice warrior, how do white people move in that space. And I think somehow having humility when that's not, as an educated, cisgender, straight, white, male, well-to-do, people, I think, and I've been indoctrinated to be kind of in charge. People come up to me in stores and ask me how, for help, ridiculous things like that. But so how do we have the humility to say, well, I might be wrong. These things that I believe, especially if they're social cultural things, how do I have the humility to say, I might be wrong about that? Right. And then I think going through that and challenging yourself and going through a period of questioning and real uncertainty, and I think then the real important place that develops into is having both some humility and some confidence, like I do have something to contribute, and I don't have to always be discounting myself 100%. And getting to that place has been a challenge for me. How do I do both of those things simultaneously?
I like that. I'm going to throw it over to Adam. We are getting questions like left, right, and center. Oh, my Lord. Keep them coming.
So I'm going to jump around here just a little bit. So, Dale, I know that you prepared some kind of facts, figures, things about how racism has kind of economic and intrinsic impacts on our community. You've already mentioned uncomfortability and difficulty finding a diverse workforce, and retaining different people in our workforce here in Eau Claire. What are some other ways that that racism can really affect our local economy?
So I think it's locally and nationally, but there's a whole series of areas. Certainly the healthcare is one of them. You look at the disparities in healthcare and health outcomes with people of color. And you go to the emergency rooms, or you go to people who don't have good health care and good insurance, and we all end up paying for that. And whether that's in private insurance that ends up subsidizing people who walk in and don't have any money, or whether it's under the federal or the state programs, you've certainly got that piece of it. You've got the whole housing and the housing value, and so when you have neighborhoods that are undervalued and segregated and have lower values, you have economic challenges and downturns with that in terms of a loss. You've also got, although I think it's a mixed bag on the if you had fewer people in poverty and fewer people that are on the federal programs, SNAP and things like that, and again, we all pay for that, and those lines get blurred between the economic versus the racial components of that. But you've got that piece of it. So I think all of those are whether it's healthcare, housing, education, or social programs and social safety net programs. We all pay for the systematic racism that it surrounds us in our community. The one though that I think is for me the most one of the most impactful, but it's not as economic, is this loss of feeling safe. And if we have fear of the unknown, we have fear of people that look different than us. We feel unsafe. And if you're not, and this, I'm probably going to be getting a little weird here as a city manager or former city manager, but hopefully we all think we all want to be happy, right? We want to have happiness in our lives, but you can't have happiness if you don't have trust. And trust has to come in a lot of different ways. It has to come in relationships with people in your household. It has to come with the relationships in your neighborhood. It has to come with your institutions. It has to come from your government. And if you don't trust your neighbors and you don't trust the other people in your community, fundamentally, you're not going to find happiness if you can't find that trust and you have fear of the other people that are around you. There was a Canadian study a few years ago that said that well, I'll ask my fellow panelists here. Do you know what the number one determinant of a crime rate in a community is? And I'm going to tell you, it's not the number of police or the number of police officers that you have in the neighborhood, but what's the number one correlating factor to whether you have a high or low crime rate in the neighborhood? It's the number of people you know within a 10-minute walk of your house.
I was trying to behave because I used to work with the guy who wrote the book.
The more people you know within a 10-minute walk of your house, the lower your crime rate's going to be. And the only reason, in order to know people within your neighborhood, you got to feel comfortable with them. You got to trust them. And so I know, Adam, your question was on the economic one, but I think, to me that this inability to, or I guess that's not inability, but having fear in a neighborhood or fear of others has a very real cost on our ability to be a highly functioning and successful community.
Excellent. And I'm glad that you tied it back to that, because the segue was a question here from Vicky, mainly geared towards Salika, but we can all kind of share thoughts. How do you feel about talking about economic costs of racism as a reason not to be racist? I mean, talking about money is a good way to get people to pay attention to you. There are really real things that are happening in really real life situations. And Vicky says, I worry that focusing on the monetary cost to white people commodifies Black people's and other people's pain.
So I agree with that, and I'd read that comment, and that's why I wanted to make the point about that feeling of unsafe and the cost that has on all of us, and how important it is to understand that cost. Economic.
I mean, sometimes we have to do the economics because that's the only way to get certain people's attention, especially if they're in a bubble. And it is easier for white people to avoid people of color than it is for people of color to avoid people who are white. Does this make sense?
Yep. Just because of the raw numbers.
Just because of the raw numbers. So to some people, I'll be honest, are indifferent to racism. There's a whole argument to be had over, and that's a whole nother show, over whether indifference to racism is racism. Because there's a bunch of philosophers having that fight out there. We're not ready to get there yet. But if they're indifferent to racism, they're not going to be indifferent to their pocketbook. And unfortunately, I mean, the civil rights movement in the South started off by raising the price of racism. Okay, you're a business and you want to be whites only, but you've got people sitting in, so you can't serve anybody. Great. How are you going to make rent? Is white supremacy really worth the cost of losing your business? You're a person in the South and you like low taxes, but people are filling the jails and raising the price of taxes and doing business. Okay, are you going to pick white supremacy? Are you going to pick higher taxes? So there's a long history of using economics to get the indifferent people to move. But there's a whole problem with, and I think Vicky's question really gets to it, the whites who are indifferent to racism, if that makes sense. And how do we get them to be interested? The reality is they should be interested because it's the right thing to do. They should. But also the pragmatic reality is sometimes the cost of their racism has to hurt them more than not being racist, if that makes sense. One of the things we teach is one of the reasons why we got rid of Jim Crow laws is it was really hurting us in the fight against communism. Because how do you recruit countries that were coming out of colonialism and tell them we are the beacon of democracy and freedom and justice for all, and they're going, have you looked in your backyard lately? How are you going to claim that? And we chose, to be honest, we chose democracy over Jim Crow. We felt that fighting communism was more important than indulging Jim Crow. Because for the indifferent whites, it sometimes feels like they're just indulging. Does that make sense? Oh, that's Uncle Joe Bob. This is what he does. He's an idiot. Just ignore him. But Uncle Joe Bob is the one who also is going to come out and give me a problem and probably yelled at my husband over in the Harbor Freight parking lot, back in March. So does that make sense? Does that make sense?
I think part of it has to do with the at least one of the ways I think about that topic is the social psychological construct of the range of acceptance. If you're going to influence someone, do you need to be in their range of acceptance in order to influence them? And that's the notion of incremental change, and getting in there and sort of trying to figure out within different subpopulations, how do you move those different subpopulations? I have this conversation with my son, who's he's pretty involved in what's going on in Minneapolis, and has a much more radicalized view, I guess, of what it's going to take to make the changes that need to happen. And I talk about trying to find where a person's range of acceptance is and trying to influence them. But in doing that, are you just papering over the profound issues and the really important issues? So the question of economics is economics really an insult to people who are suffering and for people who are dying? I think the economic argument of keeping groups separated, keeping people solidarity among lower SES workers, that you have the basket of deplorables, against people of color, when on a SES basis, they have many of the same interests. And if they could have some solidarity, they would make much more progress in terms of unionization and wages and working conditions and all of those kinds of things.
So and Salika, many times, at least in the municipal world, we think about it in terms of it's a project, and you want, it's not going to be well liked or well understood, and yet it's an important and needed project in a community. How do you make that happen, right? And whether it's a roundabout or a bridge, something like that, you're not going to make any progress if people don't understand the problem you're trying to solve. And if they don't understand the problem you're trying to solve, you're never going to be able to agree on a solution that is somewhere within that scope, Joe, that you're talking about, right? It has to be, so something that is within that scope that grabs them enough to make them want to move. And for some people, that is going to be economics, and for other people, it's going to be, empathy. And I mean, there's going to be a wide variety of reasons, but I think, for some people, it does come down to just their pocketbook. And, but I think one of the challenges is defining the problem that we're trying to solve. Because if we can't define that problem, it's very difficult to have consensus around what the solution should be.
One of the ironies for me has been, over the last 3 weeks, we've seen a lot of churches, that includes my Catholic Church, having to reckon with this idea of racism within the church. And there have been a whole lot of people having giganticus cows over the idea that racism is a sin, and that racism might be a base level sin. For Catholics, a sin may be great enough to excommunicate people. And that conversation, for some of people who are Lutheran, for some people who are Wisconsin Synod, etc., the fact that people of color and young people are leaving their churches over their indifference to sin, over their indifference to racism, I should say, it is both offending them, but it's finally forcing them to action. And you have younger people, and I reference one of my children here, who's going, well, if it takes them losing converts, are they really making progress, Mom? If it took pain to make them do the right thing, are they really doing the right thing? And I think that's one of the questions we're grappling with. We're actually going to have a religious panel on MLK, and they get to grapple with that because they'll be better at it than me. But it does get to this, this racism has a price, and for some of these churches now, racism has been, the price of racism has been the loss of the prophetic voice of the churches. And they're fighting to get that prophetic voice back if they have not been involved as a church that supports fighting racism. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
The ones that have been different and quiet.
Right.
For a lot of young people, that's important when choosing where to work, where to gather, where to worship, whatever that may be. It's becoming an increasingly important part for young people. And if we want to extend the life of our workforce, if we want to extend the life of our communities, we need to start engaging young people and we need to start listening. And I feel like that's a big part of it now. And it's a really important part for the future of a lot of organizations and businesses.
Well, without getting into the numbers, I mean, you talk about young people and embracing that piece of it. Just look at the demographics, and I mean, there's a lot of economic reason to say, we have to embrace that that change in demographics. If for no other reason, you will not have employees, and you will not have a business model that can be successful in addressing the consumer needs of a whole population. So, I mean, you got to have employees that can understand your customers.
And universities and schools need to do the same things for the same reason. If we're putting out graduates who don't know how to work with a diverse customer base, don't know how to work with a diverse workforce, they're either going to get the business sued or they're going to run away customers. And you don't want either. And that means that they will have a hard time keeping a job. And they'll be very angry at their school for not teaching them this. So there's a practical thing, but there's also, there's an ethical, but in this case, the ethical also is economically pragmatic. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm throwing it back to Adam because I'm looking at all these questions and going, oh my God, I don't know if we're going to get to all of them. Oh my Lord.
So Sheng asked, would any of the panelists be comfortable sharing experiences in which they have witnessed or engaged in white privilege, and how they feel that institutions such as education, politics, healthcare, or justice is impacted by this concept?
It's hard to differentiate everything. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's what I was going to say along the same lines. I've been a beneficiary of privilege throughout my life. One thing, early in my career, I was as a counseling center psychologist talking to a woman psychologist and asking why is the vice chancellor and associate vice chancellor, why are they kind of giving me all these opportunities? And she kindly said, what do you think they see when they look at you? They see a younger version of themselves that they want to help. So there's so many things about my life. My inventory of privileges is very long. When I think about, I could be a poster boy for pulling myself up by my bootstraps because neither of my parents graduated from high school, and all of these kinds of things, and I ended up getting a PhD, etc. But when I think about that, my father was able to get a good enough job in a factory that had good insurance, that when I was a youth, I was on the penitentiary track, as I say, rather than the college track. And the breaks that I got from police when doing all kinds of things wrong were ridiculous. I didn't end up in the criminal justice system. We had insurance when I was ready to go to treatment. I went to college at a time when the state paid for 70% of people's tuition. I benefited from so many people who so willingly took me under their wing and helped me and took care of me throughout my life. That my list of privileges is very long, and that's one of those things that I had to work with, to come to grips with, to still be proud of my accomplishments and the way my life has gone, and take some ownership of that, but also to have the humility to recognize that I've been the benefactor of privilege in so many ways. And then what that does for me, I think, is help increase my commitment to extending the ladder of success to others rather than just kind of pull it up behind me. So I really do feel like I've I've got all kinds of examples of how I benefited from white privilege.
Can I throw a question out here? Oh, or Teresa, you go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, just the concept of white privilege to me, when explained to me at first, I was like, oh yeah, that is very evident now that you've explained it to me in that way. And yet I have trouble understanding how people don't see it when it's explained to them. But I do a tip for people who are having trouble. If you find yourself put upon by society for your membership in any sort of group, like I remember when I got divorced more than 10 years ago, I thought, wow, this is a category that people do not like, these divorced people in society in many different ways. Once you get into a disliked category, or women, I've been one of those all my life, disliked by society, it's way more easy to compare and see like where you do have your privilege. So just a pro tip there. So
Dale, you got any ideas?
Sure. Well, like Joe, and what Teresa said, it's taken me a while and conversation to come to that realization that I have enjoyed quite a bit of white privilege. And probably the most tangible component of that is when I look back and I have tried hard to reach back to, I shared my elementary school experience. And the vast majority of my friends of color from elementary school are either in jail or dead. And that's really humbling when you think in terms of why is that? And why is it that happened? And I've had a successful and rewarding, career and like Joe, I've had to wrestle with how much of that is what I've done versus how much is it that, other people gave me opportunities that other people didn't have. And so it's been a very humbling search and time to come to that realization, to deal with the feelings and that come with that. So yeah, it's that would be the personal example. You're probably going to go to other things you want to talk about on that topic, but in terms of a personal perspective, that's pretty real when I've looked back and tried to find my childhood friends and realized that they're either in jail or dead, most of them, because of and the only difference we had in elementary school, well, not only, but a significant difference, was that their skin color was different than mine.
And my husband can say the same thing. And he's lucky he got out. And while he has some friends who are with him that they've stayed together for 30 plus years, there's a lot of the people he knew who are in jail or are dead now.
Right.
And it's because of that. I was going to.
Well, you realize at some point there's got to be some systems that are in place that allowed that to happen. What other explanation is there?
And then we get into systemic racism and corruption, and that's a whole nother lecture.
Right.
But I was going to throw this question at y'all because it's an interesting question. And one of my relatives asked me it today and asked me to ask it. At historically Black colleges and universities, there are scholarships for underrepresented whites. So at places like Southern and Howard, etc., and very few whites will take advantage of them. And my relative who taught at Xavier said, it seems like they're afraid of having a Black college name after their name, college name after their name, so much so that they're going to pay money rather than go. In his case, Xavier is one of the best colleges in the United States. They put out the most pharmacists, they put out the most doctors, the highest LSATs and GREs and things like that. What? And he's going, and it's free money and it's sitting there. Why aren't they doing it? And I had no answer. So I thought I'd throw this at y'all and see if y'all maybe had an answer. If maybe it was they were afraid of being a minority in a majority Black space. Is that what it is?
I could see if I had known about such a scholarship. I was very oblivious at that age, certainly, to the existence of HBCUs and any scholarship that I might get at one. But I could see being afraid of like people not liking me there because I was white, being more relevant to me than being afraid of being associated with a Black college or university. But, you know, somewhat racist motivation still, but not sure it would be like, I don't think I would be being ashamed of having the name of the college with me, but maybe more being afraid of a different community that I was not experienced with or something.
I think about the role of the parents in that decision-making process. You know, I think their motives might be different than the 17-year-old who's thinking about where to go to college, right? But I think that fear of being a minority, I think it is a very scary thing for a lot of white people. And then for those who think about prestige, I mean, there's some very prestigious HBCUs. So, but I think that prestige may be diminished for some folks, for sure.
You get into the bias of the counselors too, like who's telling the kids about which colleges and why. And that kid, they wouldn't be a good fit there. Oh, why not? Why do you think that they are not a good fit for that school?
So there may be levels of it. You know, it was part of this person was speculating that now that Harris has been elected vice president, that this is going to bring maybe more white people to HBCUs. And that if they get used to being in those environments, maybe we'll see more comfort with diversity out in the rest of the world.
Well, and I think too, when making a decision, you can come up with all sorts of excuses except for the real one.
For sure.
Like, I can say it because they don't have the bank that I bank at. They don't have the restaurant that I want in their food court in their student center. Like, I can find all sorts of excuses that aren't the actual reason of I would feel uncomfortable, et cetera, that those families may be going through. So I don't think you will ever honestly know the answer to that question, but I think it's definitely a good point to bring up and discuss.
You know, it's an interesting point because I have so many first generation students here and they're always complaining about they're broke and they can't afford college. You know, if I ever say HBCU, they look at me and go, what's that? I think over 30 years, I've only had 2 white students actually go ahead and do it. And they've both been very happy with the outcome, but the rest were all like, can't leave Eau Claire, can't leave Wisconsin.
I think, Joe, your point about the parents and Teresa, your point about the counselors and the impact is huge. I have to think on the money issue alone, had my parents known that was an option, I probably would have gone to one. They just didn't know it was an option.
I will tell you that so many whites have figured it out in Shreveport, Louisiana, that Southern University gives those scholarships, that the Shreveport campus of Southern University is now majority white. But it is the only HBCU that has had one of its campuses become majority white because of that. That's not the case with, and it's ironic because Southern University has one of the best teacher ed programs in the United States. Yes, I know I work for UW Eau Claire, but real is real. They just got ranked. I wanted to say it's number 2 in the nation, with Michigan in front of them and Ohio State behind them. That's pretty impressive.
All right. Well, this 90 minutes has once again gone by way too quickly. We've got about 5 minutes left. So we always like to leave with some action items from these conversations, things that we can kind of carry into our day-to-day lives, or things that we can do to actively be working on this in ourselves. I know that we talked about feelings of anxiety and shutting down as an ally. We also talked about effects of racism on our community, economic impacts, as well as social and emotional impacts. Salika, do you have any action items, or do any of our panelists have any action items that you'd like to suggest to our audience tonight?
Well, the biggest action item that I can suggest to our audience is to think about the ways in which we discriminate by ethnicity and to avoid them, but also to break down this idea of whiteness and to not think that, just as we're not going to think that all Black people are alike, we're not going to think that all white people are alike. Does this make sense? But that we can reach across race. Do something this week that reaches across race. And I'll let the other three panelists, do you have any action items we can tell people to do?
I think we talked a lot about the hard conversations that make us uncomfortable, like having the hard conversation with a friend or a family member who's said something racist or is, making you feel like you need to have a conversation with them about it. Just have it. Nobody is going to be better than you at doing it, and it's not going to be any fun, but you might make some progress, and then you'll have a better relationship with that person possibly, and you'll both be better people for having had the conversation.
Yep. Joe, you got any you want to throw out here?
I guess I was, as the psychologist in the group, would say continue working to expand your insight on your internal world and what your subtle reactions are when you see certain things or hear certain things. When you feel maybe challenged or uncomfortable, and really work to understand that and do something with it. Move yourself into a place of being less comfortable, because that's part of privilege, right? Is that a lot of folks have the privilege of being comfortable, but so you have to actively work, I think, to move yourself out of your comfort zone.
Okay. Dale, do you have anything you want to tell people to do?
Make it personal. It's not a theoretical issue or problem. It is very real, and it's around us. And so make it personal. Read, learn, and intentionally engage. I agree with Teresa in engaging those that are perhaps in your circle that are have a negative vibe, but also engage on the positive side. If we want a thriving community, we've got to learn to, and I mean this in the biggest, broadest way, we've got to love our neighbors. So engage it, make it personal, and learn how to love your neighbor, regardless of their skin color or ethnicity or sexuality or any other difference from you.
And let's uplift the people who are standing with us and doing the work. I think that we need to do that. We've got a number of events coming to Eau Claire. We've got Transformation Project coming. Dale was the spearhead for that. We've got Towards One Wisconsin coming. And we should let's be there.
Engage.
And I think
you can't just be in neutral on this topic. You've got to engage.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes if we're lucky, we'll get out of first gear without burning up the clutch.
I was going to say, well, I'll get into first gear off of the hill. That's what I need at the stop sign. That's what I need to do. So I think we've given you a lot to think about, and we are going to come back to this topic again, trust me.
Definitely. None of these topics, like we mentioned, we don't have all the answers. None of our panelists have all the answers, and we definitely aren't going to get as many answers as we could in 90 minutes as we could in 12 hours. But no one wants to sit here for 12 hours. Maybe they do. Who knows? Anyway, thank you to everybody that was here tonight. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you to Dr. Salika Ducksworth-Lawton, our resident panelist this evening, and for this series. We will be back next week with the topic of colorful families, talking with biracial and adoptive families. Panelists include Burl Middleton, Tanya Hughes, who was on the show a couple weeks ago, and Rachel Pride, who was on one of our first episodes as well. So we hope that you can join us next week, same time, same place here on Paragon. You can register on pablocenter.org for this series. I also want to remind everyone that we are on YouTube, and I will drop that link in the chat here. We have an entire channel of all of our conversations archived on YouTube, so you can feel free to go back and review past conversations. So many of the conversations that we're having now are becoming intersectional, and there's base knowledge that's kind of being built in past episodes, so I definitely encourage you to go back and check those out. A big thank you goes out to Pablo Center at the Confluence, Uniting Bridges, and Converge Radio. Make sure tomorrow is Giving Tuesday. Make sure that you support your local nonprofits, including Pablo Center, Converge Radio, and Uniting Bridges, all of which are 3 nonprofits that you can donate to tomorrow on Giving Tuesday. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.